He didn't break the law. He wrote it. But two white officers stopped him, mocked him, and tried to humiliate him without knowing who he was. Vad do ngoak dun? What happens when quiet dignity meets blind authority? If that question stirs something in you, tap, like, share this story, and subscribe to Mr. Mac's Stories. Let's return to the street where judgment spoke too soon and silence spoke louder. It was a quiet morning, the kind where even the birds seemed to be waiting for something. The sun was soft and low, casting long shadows over the empty sidewalks. A silver sedan sat parked beneath a maple tree. Nothing flashy, just clean and still. Officer Reed noticed it first. His patrol car rolled past slowly, his eyes narrowing just slightly as he caught sight of the man behind the wheel. A black man, maybe in his mid-60s, dressed in a pressed brown jacket and a white button-down shirt. He looked like he belonged in a university lecture hall or a church meeting. Not here. At least, not to them. Dalton leaned forward in the passenger seat. His voice was low but pointed. You see him just sitting there like he owns the block? Reed didn't respond. His gaze lingered. The man in the car wasn't fidgeting. He wasn't reaching for anything. He wasn't even on his phone, just still, calm, looking ahead. And then for a brief moment their eyes met. It was that glance that did it. It wasn't defiant. It wasn't hostile. But it wasn't afraid either. There was a kind of weight in it, a knowing, a calm that didn't ask permission. Reed clicked on the lights. The squad car pulled up with slow authority. Doors opened, boots hit pavement. The man didn't move, just reached over and rolled his window down as if he knew exactly what was coming. Reed approached on the driver's side. Dalton hung back for now. The man turned to face them fully, his hands resting gently on the steering wheel. "Morning, Sir," Reed said. "What brings you to this part of town?" The man didn't answer. Not right away. Instead, he reached into his jacket with deliberate care and pulled out a wallet. He moved slowly, not nervously, but intentionally, respectfully. He handed the ID through the open window. Elijah Boone, that was the name. Dalton stepped closer, looking over Reed's shoulder. "This your car?" Reed asked, though the registration in his hand already confirmed it. Boone gave a slow nod. "You live around here?" Dalton asked, his voice sharper now. Boone's eyes flicked to him, then back to Reed. He gave another small nod. No words. Just stillness. Dalton's hand moved to rest near his belt. "You got somewhere to be, or just people watching today?" Boone stayed silent, calm, present, almost like a mirror refusing to reflect their aggression. There was something infuriating about it. Reed felt it first. That discomfort. That impulse to provoke. Because when someone doesn't flinch, when they don't give you anything to grab onto, you start to wonder who's really in control. Dalton's tone grew more clipped. "You think you're better than us?" Boone finally spoke. His voice was low and measured. "I think we all have a role. I'm letting you do yours." There was no mockery in his tone. No heat. Just a statement. It landed heavier than any insult. Reed stepped back slightly. He scanned the man again. Brown shoes polished. Slacks without a single wrinkle. Nails trimmed. Tie neat. Every detail quietly demanded respect. Every detail said, "I know who I am." And that somehow was the problem. "Step out of the vehicle," Reed said. Boone obeyed. Slowly. Gracefully. He opened the door and stood tall. Not in a way that threatened. In a way that simply was. They told him to keep his hands where they could see them. He did. They told him to stand by the hood of his car. He did. Dalton walked around the back, opening the rear door without asking. Boone said nothing. Inside, there was nothing but a single hardcover book on the back seat and a jacket neatly folded. No bag, no tools, no threat. Reed opened the front passenger door. Glove box empty. Registration valid. Inspection sticker clean. There was no reason. And they knew it, but neither of them could admit it out loud. Because the real reason had nothing to do with what Elijah Boone carried or what he might have been doing. It was the way he looked at them. The way he stood. The fact that his silence wasn't born from fear, but from patience. And that made them uneasy. A woman walking her dog slowed down nearby. She glanced at the scene, sensing the tension. Her steps faltered, as if unsure whether to stay or keep going. She looked at Boone. He looked back, calm, composed. Dalton barked, "Move along, ma'am." She did, and in the pause that followed, Boone turned his gaze back toward the officers. He didn't challenge them. He didn't plead. He simply stood there, hands visible, heart steady. That was the moment. That was when something shifted. Because in the silence, in that long, unbroken silence, both officers began to realize they weren't looking at a man who had anything to hide. They were looking at a man who had already seen this moment play out 100 times and still chose to meet it with dignity. They just didn't know yet how badly they had underestimated him, but they would. They were about to find out exactly who Elijah Boone was. There was something in the air that morning, something heavy, a silence too dense to lift. Elijah Boone stood quietly by the hood of his car, hands resting gently in front of him. He didn't fidget, didn't glance around. He just waited. Not with fear, but with a kind of stillness that made the officers more nervous than they liked to admit. License and registration. Officer Reed repeated the words flat and expectant. He was younger than Boone by decades, but the way he stood suggested he thought age and dignity could be erased with a badge. Boone didn't rush. He moved calmly, reaching inside his coat pocket. Reed's hand shot toward his holster. Officer Dalton mirrored the motion on the other side, tense as coiled wire. But Boone didn't flinch. What he pulled out wasn't a license. It wasn't even a wallet. It was a photograph creased at the corners, soft from time. He held it for a moment as if it still held warmth, then offered it forward without a word. It was an old photo of a woman standing in front of a modest white house. She was smiling, sunlight in her hair, and beside her stood a younger Boone, arms gently around her waist. The picture spoke of love that had weathered seasons and sorrow. Reed stared at it, confused. Dalton smirked. "What's this supposed to be?" Dalton asked, his voice already laced with suspicion. Boone didn't answer right away. He looked at the picture, then said softly, "My wife. She passed away 10 years ago today." There was no dramatics in his tone, just memory, the kind that doesn't need to raise its voice to be heard. Dalton scoffed. "You showing us this for sympathy? Trying to get out of something?" Boone didn't react. He carefully folded the photo and set it on the hood of the car like it was something sacred. Reed's voice hardened. "We need to check your vehicle. Open the trunk." Boone looked at them, his eyes steady, unreadable. Then he turned and walked to the back of the car. He didn't argue, didn't sigh. He just unlocked the trunk. The lid lifted slowly. No sudden movements, no hesitation. Inside lay a pressed navy blue jacket, neatly folded, a bouquet of fresh white lilies wrapped in brown paper, and a small wooden box, simple but polished. Dalton leaned in, squinting. "What is all this?" Boone spoke quietly. "She loved lilies. Every year I bring the same bouquet, same suit, same day." Neither officer said anything. Reed looked down, not at the flowers, but at the flag pin still attached to the lapel of Boone's jacket. His mouth opened slightly, but he didn't speak. Boone reached into the trunk and gently opened the wooden box. Inside, folded tightly, was an American flag. Beneath it, a certificate yellowed slightly with age and honor from the Department of Defense, commemorating her years as a nurse in a veterans hospital. "She served," Boone said almost to himself. "So did I." For the first time, Reed looked unsure. Dalton crossed his arms, still clinging to authority. "Next time, lead with that." "We don't know who you are." Boone turned his gaze toward him and said quietly but clearly, "I shouldn't have to." The line landed like a soft hammer. No shouting, no drama, but it echoed in the silence. From across the street, someone watched. A woman with a dog paused mid-step. A jogger slowed down. No one interfered, but they saw. They always did. Reed shifted uncomfortably. "You're free to go." Boone nodded once. Not a thank you, just acknowledgement. He closed the trunk. Slowly, took the bouquet in one hand and the folded box in the other. He walked to the front seat and opened the door, placing everything with care. But he didn't drive off. He sat there looking ahead, waiting. Dalton walked away first, muttering something under his breath. Reed followed slower this time. As Boone sat in the driver's seat, eyes still on the horizon, the quiet grew heavier. Not oppressive, but expectant, as if something in the balance had shifted. Just a little. And out of view beneath the folded flag and the still wrapped flowers lay one more item, a printed speech neatly typed. The title read in crisp, bold letters, "Testimony before the State Assembly on Police Reform." But the officers hadn't seen that, not yet. For a few seconds, the street felt suspended in time, as if the city had briefly stepped aside to allow this moment to unfold. The air was still, the sound of distant traffic softened, and even the tension between Boone and the officers seemed to quiet itself for just a breath. Elijah reached into the open trunk and lifted the bouquet with both hands, careful not to let the stems crush against each other. The white lilies, still dewy and fresh, trembled slightly in his grip, but not from fear. It was the kind of trembling you only see when something delicate is held with reverence. He stepped back around the car, moving not like a man under scrutiny, but like someone attending to a memory. Then, without saying a word, he gently placed the bouquet on the hood, right beside the old photograph. The motion was small, simple, but it said more than any speech could. There was no performance in what he did, no plea, just presence. The kind of presence that makes people pause, that makes even those who don't understand feel something stir in their chest. Dalton looked away first, pretending to check his radio. Reed stayed where he was, eyes flicking from the flowers to the man but offering no words. Across the street, a woman walking her dog had stopped. She stood still now, leash slack in her hand, the dog sitting obediently beside her. She wasn't recording. She wasn't whispering to a neighbor. She simply watched, her head slightly bowed as if she recognized something solemn taking place. Then came the faint sound of a phone click. A boy, maybe 15 or 16, had slowed his bike to a stop a few yards down the sidewalk. He stood with one foot on the pedal, one on the curb, holding up his phone just high enough to catch the scene. His eyes weren't mocking. They were wide, uncertain. Not because of Boone, but because he could feel something was happening, and he didn't know quite how to name it. Boone didn't notice the phone. Or if he did, he gave no sign. He stood there, both hands resting on the edge of the hood, his head slightly lowered. His breathing was steady. His eyes focused on the lilies. Somewhere inside that silence, something began to turn. By the time Boone finally lifted the flowers again and walked them back to the passenger seat, placing them beside the wooden box, the boy had already sent the clip to a friend. And that friend, not knowing what else to say, posted it with a simple caption. He just stood there, with flowers, and they treated him like a threat. The clip was under 15 seconds. No sound, no shouting, just Boone's steady movements, the flowers on the hood, the look in his eyes. But the quiet hit harder than any confrontation. Within an hour, the clip was reshared by a local teacher, then a journalist, then a veterans advocacy group. Some called it Dignity in Motion. Some called it unbearable. Others said nothing at all, simply hitting the share button and letting the silence speak for itself. Meanwhile, Boone sat in his car, still unmoving, still watching the horizon as if waiting for something larger than justice. Reed and Dalton had returned to their patrol car, speaking in hushed voices. One kept glancing back. The other refused to look at all. The woman with the dog finally crossed the street, not to interfere, just to pass. But as she neared Boone's window, she slowed and gave him a small, respectful nod. Not of pity, not of guilt, just a gesture. Simple and human. Boone nodded back, a faint gesture that barely moved his chin. And still he said nothing. The flowers now rested against the seat. The folded flag sat quietly in the box, and the speech, still hidden beneath it all, waited like a heartbeat pressed between two pages. By that evening, the clip had surpassed 20,000 views, not because it was dramatic, but because something about the man's silence made people uncomfortable in a way they couldn't explain. Because deep down they knew silence like that doesn't come from weakness. It comes from knowing something most people spend their whole lives trying to understand. Inside the squad car, Reed's hand hovered for a second over the radio. There was a flicker of something in his face, a hesitation that hadn't been there minutes before. Maybe it was the silence that unsettled him, or maybe it was the boy on the bike still filming from the sidewalk. Either way, something had shifted. And when he finally pressed the button to call dispatch, his voice was tighter than usual. Unit 428 requesting identification verification. Subject name Elijah Boone, 65. African-American male. Local residence unknown. There was a pause on the other end, the kind that stretches just a second too long. Then came the voice from dispatch. A woman's voice, steady at first, but it wavered when she repeated the name. Can you confirm that name again? Reed repeated it, slower this time. The air in the car turned still. The voice came back quieter now. There was a sound of typing, a rustle of papers, and then a longer silence. When the dispatcher finally spoke again, she didn't sound like someone reading a routine file. Sir Elijah Boone is listed as a former state policy advisor, co-author of House Bill 1187, the judicial reform package from 6 years ago. The one that rewrote half the department's procedural guidelines. There was no mistaking the tone. It was the kind of tone you hear when someone realizes they've just tripped over a name that lives in history books. Inside the patrol car, Dalton let out a half laugh that didn't sound like amusement. Reed said nothing. He was staring straight ahead as if suddenly unsure of where they were or what they were doing. Dalton tried to recover first. Maybe it's not the same guy. Could be a different Boone. The radio crackled again. Negative dispatch confirmed. Matching photo on record. That's him. Outside, Boone still hadn't moved. He was seated calmly, hands folded in his lap, eyes resting on the bouquet beside him. But something else had moved. Because by now, the clip was spreading like ripples in still water. Shared on veterans forums, on community pages, on the accounts of former lawmakers who still remembered the closed-door hearings, the endless debates, the long nights when Boone had stayed after hours explaining clause after clause, until even the most hardened politicians understood what justice should look like. The clip had a new title now. Someone had updated it without adding music or commentary. Just 6 words in white font on a black background. He just stood there, and we didn't. In the precinct's shared group chat, a younger officer had already posted the link. 10 minutes later, a captain commented underneath it, "Tell me this is not real." But it was. In the car, Reed shifted uncomfortably. Dalton leaned forward, elbows on his knees, trying to look like he didn't care. "This doesn't change anything," he said too quickly. "We still had cause." Reed didn't answer, because something had in fact changed. Not in Boone. He was the same man who had stood quietly moments ago, who had handed over a photo instead of a license, who had placed flowers on a car hood without saying a word. No, the change had happened in the space around him. In the looks the officers now exchanged. In the way Dalton's words didn't sound nearly as confident anymore. In the way Reed kept glancing at his phone where the thumbnail of the video now sat in his notifications like a blinking warning light. From inside the car, they watched Boone. Not as a threat, not as a suspect, but with the kind of uncertainty people feel when they realize they've made a mistake too public to undo. Reed finally spoke, his voice lower now. "What do we do?" Dalton didn't have an answer. Because there wasn't one. Not really. Not when the world was already watching. And outside, Boone finally turned his head. Just slightly. Just enough to meet their gaze through the windshield. He didn't smile. He didn't nod. He just looked. And for the first time that morning, it wasn't him being judged. It was them. Inside the squad car, Officer Reed hesitated before pressing the radio button. His hand lingered midair as if he sensed something about to shift. Maybe it was the silence outside pressing in too tightly. Maybe it was the boy still filming from the curb, or the way Elijah Boone sat so still as if he belonged there more than they ever would. Whatever it was, Reed's voice came out flatter than usual when he finally spoke. "Unit 428 requesting ID verification. Subject name Elijah Boone. 65 years old. African-American male. Local address unknown." There was a pause on the other end, the kind that stretches just long enough to make someone sit up straighter. "Repeat that name, please." Reed did, slower this time. There was typing in the background, a rustle of paper. The dispatcher's voice was lower when it came back. Confirming subject as Elijah Boone, retired policy advisor. Listed as co-author of House Bill 1187, the judicial reform statute enacted in 2019. Inside the car, Dalton snorted and leaned forward, frowning like he was trying to make sense of the words. "You serious right now?" There was no answer. The radio stayed quiet. Dalton chuckled again, but it sounded strained. "Probably some mix-up. Can't be the same guy." Then the dispatcher's voice returned firmer now. "Confirmed match. Photo and records align. That's him." Reed turned slowly. His eyes met Dalton's. No jokes now. No swagger. Outside, Boone remained exactly as he was, sitting beside the cruiser, quiet as a chapel. The flowers still lay on the hood of his car. The white petals glowed in the daylight. He hadn't moved an inch. But everything around him had. The clip recorded by the student had already taken flight online. Someone had edited it simply without music or captions. Just 6 words in white font at the bottom of the screen. He just stood there. And we didn't. It hit a nerve. Not just with strangers online, but with people who knew that name. Retired lawmakers, judges, civil rights attorneys, veterans, people who remembered the long nights in state halls debating legislation that had once divided a state. Boone had been there through it all. Walking the line between the system and the people, it often failed. Inside the precinct group chat, the link had been shared 3 times already. A senior officer typed only 4 words beneath it. Tell me this isn't real. But it was. Dalton looked uneasy now. He shifted in his seat and cleared his throat. Look, we didn't know who he was. That doesn't change protocol. Reed didn't answer. His eyes were still locked on Boone, now with a tension that wasn't there before. Not fear, not yet, but something close, like he was starting to understand just how badly they'd misread the situation. For the first time that day, the silence didn't feel like power. It felt like reckoning. Boone finally turned his head. Slowly. He looked through the windshield at the 2 men. His eyes weren't cold. They weren't angry, but they were steady, unmoving. The kind of look that makes a man examine himself without a word being spoken. Dalton looked away first. Reed glanced at his phone. The video had just crossed 70,000 views. What now? He muttered. No one answered. Because when the world is watching, there's no script left to follow. And sometimes, the most powerful man in the room is the one who never raised his voice at all. The first thing that came down wasn't justice. It was a memo. Officer Dalton had been placed on administrative leave, with pay. No badge, no duties, but the check would keep coming every 2 weeks, just like always. To the department, it was protocol. To the public, it felt like a slap in the face. Social media exploded. Local radio hosts questioned the decision. Outside the precinct, someone taped a piece of cardboard to the entrance that read, "You protect your own and nobody else." Inside those walls, something colder was spreading. A young officer named Camara, only 2 years on the job, was scheduled to ride with Dalton the following week. He quietly asked to be reassigned, said he didn't feel comfortable, didn't feel safe. He didn't say more than that, but he didn't have to. The room knew, and no one challenged him. Dalton didn't respond publicly. He stayed off camera, off the record, but those who had worked with him for years began talking in whispers. One officer said he always had a chip on his shoulder. Another recalled how he laughed too hard during certain arrests. Patterns that had once gone unnoticed were suddenly being counted, and the tally was not in his favor. Reed, meanwhile, had received a different kind of order. Mandatory retraining, sensitivity seminars, procedural refreshers, the kind of requirement that comes with awkward PowerPoint slides and coffee that tastes like cardboard. But Reed didn't fight it. He didn't grumble. Instead, he made a call, not to the department, not to his union rep. He tried to reach Elijah Boone. He got an address, not a number. He drove out to a quiet neighborhood where the houses stood close together and time seemed to move a little slower. When he knocked, a woman opened the door. She looked him up and down and asked what he wanted. Reed, still in civilian clothes, said simply that he had come to apologize. She didn't smile. She didn't nod. She just said he's not taking visitors and closed the door. Reed stood there for a few seconds longer than he needed to. Then he walked back to his car and sat in silence, hands on the steering wheel, the weight of everything he had worn and believed pressing into his chest. For the first time in years, the uniform he had dedicated his life to began to feel like something heavier than cloth and duty. It felt like history, like burden, like debt. That night, a story broke. It wasn't just a blog post or a tweet. It was a full-page article in the Sunday edition of the city's most read paper. A journalist had gone digging and found records buried beneath years of bureaucracy and silence. Dalton, it turned out, had been flagged before. Complaints filed. Excessive force alleged. Words like intimidation and racial profiling appeared more than once, and each time the outcome had been the same. Investigation closed. No further action. This time, though, was different, because this time the world had watched. In a local cafe, a group of college students discussed the article while waiting in line. A retired judge clipped the page and mailed it to a former colleague. At a town hall, someone stood up and read from the column aloud, ending with the words, "Maybe silence was never his greatest crime. Maybe it was ours." The department held a press conference. No questions were taken. Just a statement. They promised a full review, a commitment to transparency, a listening campaign. But the air had already shifted. It wasn't just about Dalton anymore. It was about the cracks in the walls people had pretended not to see, the kind that had let too many slip through and too many suffer in silence. And while Reed sat on the edge of his bed that night, the old training manual open in front of him but unread, he began to wonder if he could still carry that badge without dragging the past behind him with every step. Because some uniforms don't just weigh on your shoulders, they weigh on your soul. The news came quietly, but it hit the town like thunder. Officer Dalton had been officially placed on administrative leave. No badge, no street patrol, no uniform. But his paycheck somehow remained untouched. To the department, it was procedure. To the public, it was an insult that echoed louder than any apology could have. Outside the precinct, chalk messages began appearing on the sidewalk. Names written in thick, trembling letters. Not just Elijah Boone's, but others. Names that had slipped through headlines. Names from past complaints. Names that had never been spoken in court. It felt less like protest and more like a memory wall, one written by people who were tired of forgetting. Inside, the atmosphere had shifted. It wasn't loud. It wasn't violent. It was something colder, more decisive. A young officer, barely a year on the force, refused to take his scheduled shift with Dalton. He said he didn't trust him, said he couldn't justify walking beside someone who made people afraid. No one argued. No one forced him. His silence had more weight than any badge on his chest. Reed, on the other hand, received a different directive. Mandatory retraining. He had been ordered to attend a course on cultural sensitivity and ethical engagement. Most officers, when given such an assignment, went through the motions and clocked out. Reed did something else. He asked for an address. He showed up at Boone's house in plain clothes, no badge, no backup, no rehearsed statement. Just a man standing in front of another man's door hoping to fix something too big to fit into words. Boone didn't answer. His daughter did. Her eyes didn't flinch when she saw who was standing on the porch. He introduced himself softly, said he came to offer an apology. She looked at him for a long time, the way someone studies a scar they've seen before but wish they hadn't. Then she said one sentence. "We're not accepting visitors right now." The door didn't slam. It closed with the kind of finality that doesn't need sound. Reed didn't knock again. He stood for a few seconds longer, then left. That evening, a column appeared in the city's largest paper. A journalist had pulled old files records buried in procedural clutter. What she found was not new to the department, but it was new to the people. Multiple complaints against Dalton, most dismissed. A few marked insufficient evidence. One marked retraining recommended with no follow-up. The article didn't scream. It whispered in cold clinical detail, and it cut deeper because of it. The public responded fast. Podcasts dissected the patterns. Community groups demanded access to internal reviews. And while some shouted in protest, others simply stopped showing up to support the badge. Churches held forums. Veterans posted online asking why the man who co-authored the very reforms they had once praised had been treated like a threat. The pressure wasn't just external anymore. It was inside the department's walls, inside the daily meetings, inside the mirror. Some officers avoided looking into. Dalton hadn't spoken publicly, but Reed could see it in the way he walked now, no longer with pride, but with something heavier. Not guilt, exactly. Not yet. But the creeping realization that the uniform no longer protected him from the truth others now demanded he face. Every step in the hallway had started to echo, not because it was louder, but because everyone had gone quiet. Conversations stopped when he entered. People looked down, not because they feared him, but because they no longer respected him. And for a man like Dalton, that silence was the first real punishment he had ever felt. It wasn't official. It wasn't signed by a judge or delivered by a captain. But it was there, heavy, in the air, in the looks, in the choices of those who now chose to stand a few feet farther from him than they used to. Meanwhile, Reed sat alone in his car outside the training facility. the paper still folded on his passenger seat. He reread the article's final line again and again. Sometimes the badge doesn't shield you from consequence. Sometimes it reveals why you should have faced one long ago. He didn't know what his next step would be, but for the first time in his career, Reed understood something he had never truly faced. The uniform didn't just represent authority. It carried the memory of every silence it had ever ignored. That morning, the council chamber was already tense. A vote was scheduled on slashing a portion of the legal defense budget for underserved communities. Most people in the room didn't expect pushback. The decision was expected to pass quietly. It was just another line item, another cut that would go unnoticed. Then the doors opened, and Elijah Boone walked in. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He moved slowly, like time had taught him not to rush toward justice, but to let it rise in its own time. He was dressed plainly but with intention, the same black vest he had worn in countless hearings and forums across the state. The same shoes he wore when he walked hand in hand with his wife through the courthouse steps years ago. He took a seat in the last row right near the exit. No one noticed at first, but the few who turned around stopped mid-sentence. Whispers died in their throats. One by one, heads turned. Conversations tapered off. The man hadn't spoken a word, and yet the energy in the room changed completely. A junior councilman, one of the loudest voices behind the budget cuts, had just begun speaking into the mic. His voice faltered. He looked down at his notes, then back at the rows of people ahead. And when his eyes landed on Elijah Boone, he froze. You could almost hear the air get thinner. He cleared his throat and tried again. As we review the allocation for the... But it was no use. He wasn't looking at his notes anymore. He was looking at a man whose silence carried the weight of everything they were about to vote against. No words were exchanged. No signs were raised. No protests erupted. Just one man sitting in the back of the room with a dignity that demanded more than a microphone ever could. An aide near the side wall began to type something on her phone. A reporter shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glanced toward the back, then leaned over to whisper something to his editor. Someone in the press box raised a camera but hesitated as if the flash would somehow dishonor the moment. Then finally, a stillness settled in. The kind of stillness that didn't ask for applause, didn't need a chant, didn't demand a headline. It simply stood in contrast to everything hollow that had come before it. The meeting didn't end with a fiery speech or a dramatic walkout. It ended quietly, and the motion to vote was withdrawn. Not postponed, not tabled, withdrawn altogether. The proposed cuts were erased from the agenda. Elijah remained seated for several more minutes. Then he stood, nodded once toward the chair of the council, and exited through the same door he came in. Later that day, a clip from the chamber began to circulate online. The video didn't show much. No one spoke. It was just footage of him entering the room, sitting in the back, and the subtle shift in every face present. The video's caption read, "He never had to speak. We just had to listen." Within hours, thousands had shared it. Veterans, lawyers, teachers, mothers, even a few former council members. They didn't share it because of a speech. They shared it because of the silence. The kind of silence that reminds you who really carries the truth in the room. And by nightfall, people were already asking, where's he going next? The precinct bulletin board once held routine memos about traffic stops and shift rotations, but this morning a new flyer had taken center stage. Titled in bold letters, Ellison Protocol, Community Engagement Guidelines. It marked a turning point not only in policy, but in conscience. The name came not from a bureaucrat or a politician, but from a quiet man whose dignity had withstood what many others would have fought against in rage. And though it didn't bear his face, everyone knew it was about Elijah Boone. Reed stood before a group of newly recruited officers, hands lightly clasped, his eyes softer than they had been weeks ago. His uniform, once worn with unconscious pride, now carried a visible weight on his shoulders. He cleared his throat and said, "I used to think the law protected me just because I wore the badge. Turns out it judged me too. And it judged me more harshly when I failed to see what justice actually looked like." No one interrupted. Not a cough, not a chair creaking, just the weight of his words hanging there like an invisible shift in the room. For some, this was just a speech. but for Reed, it was a confession. Across town, Dalton sat alone in his apartment, staring at a letter he hadn't expected. It was written in careful handwriting from a retired officer he once respected. The note was short. "You mocked a man who made you possible." No signature, just silence, the kind that can't be answered with excuses. That day, the local police department did something it had never done in its 70-year history. It issued a formal public apology to Elijah Boone. The statement didn't come from a PR firm. It came from the chief standing before microphones he didn't want to face, acknowledging that the system had not just failed once it had failed for decades. And Elijah Boone was the man who held up that truth without ever raising his voice. News crews captured it all, but the footage that went most viral wasn't from the press conference. It was from an artist quietly painting a mural on the side of the City Hall building. Stroke by stroke, a tall portrait of Boone emerged, his eyes steady, his posture still. In one hand, he held a worn leather notebook, in the other, a folded American flag. And behind him, not flames, not outrage, but a single white flower blooming from concrete. Children walked by and stopped. Parents explained who he was, and for the first time in years, a town divided by silence began to talk. Not about rage, not even about justice, but about the cost of forgetting what dignity looks like when it stands quietly in front of you, asking nothing, yet changing everything. At Jefferson Elementary, the civics class had always begun the same way, with quiet murmurs, half-hearted glances at textbooks, and the rustle of notebooks being opened more out of habit than intent. But this week, something was different. The lights dimmed, and the projector lit up with a video titled, "He Just Stood There." It was the same clip that had gone viral weeks ago, showing a man who had said nothing but somehow said everything. The teacher didn't explain much. She simply hit play. And for the next 90 seconds, the room watched Elijah Boone standing by his car, a white bouquet resting on the hood, his expression calm but unreadable. There were no words, no music, no edits, just the weight of presence. When the lights came back on, no one moved right away. Then a hand slowly rose near the back of the room. It belonged to Janelle, a quiet girl who rarely spoke in class. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. He didn't raise his voice, and that's why I heard him. The teacher didn't respond immediately. She didn't need to. The class had just learned more about integrity than any textbook could offer. Later that day, in a different school, a group of high schoolers gathered in the gym for a civics project they had renamed the Silent Stand. One by one, they walked to the center of the gym floor, stood silently for 60 seconds, and then walked back. No speeches, no slogans, just stillness, and every phone camera in the room was rolling. Within hours, those videos began appearing on TikTok. Each clip was captioned simply with his name, Elijah Boone. It became a kind of modern protest, a new language of silence for a generation fluent in noise. Teenagers who had once mocked anything slow or still were now teaching each other how to stand for something without saying a word. In a community center not far away, an elderly man in a cardigan stood before a small group of parents. His name was Mr. Lowell, a retired teacher who once taught English to 6th graders. He held a crumpled essay in his hands and smiled faintly. "This was written by Elijah Boone," he said. "He was the only student I ever had who handed in an essay soaked in tears. And you know what? I never graded it. I just folded it, put it in my desk drawer, and kept it for 40 years. He passed the paper around and the room fell quiet. The words, though faded, still carried the weight of a boy who had once believed that writing could change something. That evening, a podcast episode titled The Kids Who Listened aired across several platforms. Hosted by a young black woman who had followed the story from the beginning, it reflected on how the image of one man had become a mirror for an entire town. She spoke softly, almost as if telling a bedtime story, but her message was piercing. We used to think protests needed volume, but maybe what we needed all along was attention. And attention begins in silence. By the end of the week, schools across the district had added Boone's story into their ethics curriculum. Some paired it with lessons on civil rights. Others just showed the video and asked one question. "What did you see?" And somewhere in that same town, a group of middle school students passed around a paintbrush after class. On a blank wall in their school library, they began sketching a mural. No dramatic poses, just the outline of a man in a simple jacket standing with his hands folded and his eyes steady. Behind him, dozens of tiny painted flowers began to bloom. It wasn't the adults who chose to remember him this way. It was the children. And somehow that made all the difference. The cemetery was quiet that morning. The kind of quiet that doesn't just hush the air, but slows your steps as you move through it. Elijah Boone walked with the same steady pace he had always kept, carrying a white bouquet in one hand and a small framed photo in the other. The grass was slightly damp, the earth soft beneath his shoes, but his footing never wavered. He reached the modest headstone near the far row, the one marked only with a name and a date, and the phrase she had chosen for herself. Grace in the fight. He knelt not with ceremony, but with the careful gentleness of a man who had knelt here many times before. One hand smoothed the edges of the soil. The other adjusted the photo so it faced just the right way, catching the light, but not the glare. Then he placed the flowers beside it, not at the base, but just off to the side, as if leaving room for someone else who might come after him. He didn't speak, not even a whisper, just breathed, closed his eyes, and stayed there a while. A few steps behind him stood the teenager who had filmed the moment weeks ago. He had come alone, wearing a simple hoodie, his phone not raised this time. He didn't need to film again. Some things were meant to be witnessed, not captured. He didn't interrupt, didn't ask questions. He just stood there still and respectful, like he had learned something from watching the man before him. After a few minutes, Elijah rose. He didn't turn to greet the boy or acknowledge the presence behind him. He simply nodded once, not to the teen, but to the grave, as if saying something final to the woman he had loved. Then he walked away, shoulders, even hands, empty. The camera fades not with music or commentary, but with the soft echo of gravel under careful steps. A narrator's voice enters steady and low as images begin to appear one after another. The first is the mural, now complete, where Boone stands silently beneath a sky of painted silence. Then comes the classroom filled with students who are not just listening, but learning from what was never shouted. On the whiteboard behind them is written a single sentence in bold, careful strokes. Before you enforce the law, remember who wrote it. In a world that so often rewards volume, his was a voice made of stillness. He never raised it. He didn't march or demand or argue. He just showed up again and again with a presence that could not be ignored. And somehow that had done more than all the shouting ever could. As the final image lingers, a subtle breeze lifts through the trees where he once knelt. The sound is faint, but it is there. The hush of leaves, the rhythm of a breath, the echo of a man who never asked to be remembered but somehow always would be. Because some laws are written in ink. Others are written in how you choose to stand. Sometimes the strongest voices don't shout. They show up, they stand still, and they let the truth speak for itself. Elijah Boone didn't ask to be heard. He chose to live in a way that couldn't be ignored. His silence moved a town. His presence reshaped a system. And his story reminds us that justice isn't always loud, but it is always watching. If this story touched you, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who still believes in quiet strength. And don't forget to subscribe to Mr. Max Stories, where every story gives voice to the unheard and dignity to the overlooked. Your support helps us keep telling the stories that matter. Stories that stay with you. Stories that echo. Because here at Mr. Max, we don't just tell stories, we remember them.